Hello everyone, my name is Kent. In this video, I'm going to talk about why I believe that Christians should keep the Sabbath on the seventh day of the week as commanded by God in the Bible. Now, of course, most churches today, they celebrate Christ and they worship on Sunday, but throughout my spiritual journey, I have discovered that I believe that God actually wants us to keep the Sabbath day, which is the seventh day of the week, and He wants us to keep that Sabbath day holy. And I'm going to read through the Bible verses that convinced me, in hopes that you might have something to think about, and perhaps you'll agree and then start worshiping on the Sabbath. The first verse that I want to read today is from the Ten Commandments, which is found in Exodus 20. So let's read that now. Exodus 20, verses 8 until 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So there's two things in this passage that I want to point out. The first one is that this is the only commandment of the Ten Commandments that uses the word remember. When this was given to the Israelites, he says remember, which would indicate that the Sabbath was in place before the commandment was given. And we know this because God sanctified the Sabbath day on the seventh day when he rested, and he made it holy. That can be found in Genesis. Now, the second point that I want to make is that this is one of the commandments of God. And for some reason, within our modern day churches, within Christianity, this is the one commandment that gets pushed to the side and ignored. But for me, this commandment should actually be kept, because this is one of the commandments that show that we love God. Remember that Jesus said the first commandment is love God with all your heart and your soul, your mind. And then he also said, if you love me, keep my commandments. So if we are to love God, we should keep his commandments. And this is one of the ones that should be kept. That was the first verse that, of course, made me think about, well, do we really need to keep the Sabbath? The second verse that really made me start to think that the Sabbath should be kept by Christians comes from Hebrews. And this is a long passage, so I'm not going to read the entire thing, but if you have time, go to Hebrews 3, start at verse 7, and read all the way to Hebrews 4, verse 11. So in this passage, it talks about how God saved the Israelites out of Egypt and promised that he would give them the promised land of milk and honey. Ultimately, though, the Israelites, they disobeyed God's commandments, and a lot of them were killed in the desert. Actually, most of them were killed in the desert. God didn't take them out of the desert for 40 years because of their disobedience. So let's get to the verses that I want to read that point this out. Okay, so I'm going to start reading from Hebrews 3, verses 16 to 19. For who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, not all those who came out of Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. So this passage, it doesn't specifically talk about the Sabbath, I know, but it does talk about how the Israelites were saved out of Egypt, they were given the promised land, and they didn't enter into that promise because of disobedience and unbelief. The one thing that we really need to take out of this passage is that Christians today need to be obedient to God and they need to believe. Otherwise, we might not enter into that rest. Now, I'm going to go to Hebrews 4. So let's go to Hebrews 4, verse 4:11. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David after so long a time, just as has been said before, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, for if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience. So in this passage, it says that the people that failed to enter into that rest, for in the Israelites' case, it was the promised land, they failed to enter into that rest because of their own disobedience. They had been preached the good news, but they failed to enter because of disobedience. And the interesting thing about verse 9 and verse 10, it says that there remains a Sabbath day rest for the people of God. And in verse 10, we need to look at the capitalization of the words here. For the one who has entered his rest, his is capitalized, being the one who has entered God's rest, has himself also rested from his works. So the person that enters into God's rest has also rested from the person's works, which means that he does rest from his works, as God did from his. And we know that God rested from his works on the seventh day, and then he sanctified it and made it holy. Again, that passage is in Genesis. Verse 11 says that we need to be diligent to enter that rest, which is the Sabbath day, that no one will fall through the same example of disobedience. Now, I know there's people that are going to doubt that rest in this verse 11 means the Sabbath day, but the disobedience that is referred to here is actually about the Sabbath day. And I can show you a passage that explains that. Obviously, we could read through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy and sort that out. The Israelites had many things that made God angry. There were two things that made God angry. One was the Sabbath, and the other one was idolatry and worshiping false gods and worshiping idols. Now, to prove this point, that Hebrews 11 is actually talking about the Sabbath, and that example of disobedience is not keeping the Sabbath day holy, I want to go to Ezekiel 20. And you're probably thinking, well, that's kind of weird, Kent. But this is a prophecy where God is speaking, and he says specifically that what made him angry with the Israelites when they were in the desert is that they did not keep the Sabbath day holy. So let's go to Ezekiel 20, verse 10 to verse 13. So I took them out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. I gave them my statutes and informed them of my ordinances, by which if a man observes them, he will live. Also I gave them my Sabbaths, to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes, and they rejected my ordinances, by which if a man observes them, he will live. And my Sabbaths they greatly profaned. Then I resolved to pour out my wrath on them in the wilderness, to annihilate them. Okay, so this is God speaking through his prophet Ezekiel. And it's a very interesting passage when you stop and read this. God is angry at the Israelites because he gave them his ordinance, and he says he also gave them the Sabbaths, which is different than the ordinances. It is separate from the ordinance. And it says here that he gave us the Sabbath to be a sign between me and them. So the Sabbath is a sign between us and God. And it tells us the purpose of the Sabbath. And it says that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. If we skip ahead to Ezekiel 20, it says essentially the same thing with slightly different words. And it says that they might know that I am the Lord their God. So that is the reason for the Sabbath, and that is why we should keep the Sabbath. Or at least that's another reason. Not only has God commanded us to keep it holy, but if we keep that Sabbath, that is how we learn about God. That is how we become to know God. That is how we become to know that God is the one that sanctified us. Makes it very important. But to actually tie this to my previous point is that this prophecy specifically talks about the Israelites in Egypt, and it specifically talks about how it was the Sabbaths that made God angry. Now, again, I would encourage you to read all of Ezekiel 20 because it's an interesting read. He also talks about idolatry and false worship as being another thing that made him angry. But in Ezekiel 20, he repeats over and over and over again that it was the disobedience in following the Sabbaths is what was the result of the Israelites that did not get to enter into their promised land. The next verse that I want to talk about, again, is from the New Testament, and it's Colossians 2, specifically verse 16. So in Colossians 2, the specific verse that I want to point out here is verse 16. But to get the context of this message, let's start to read at verse 8. So Colossians 2, verse 8, we'll read until verse 17. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the empty principles of the world rather than according to Christ. For in him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form, and in him you have been made complete, and he is the head over all rule and authority. And in him you were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, in the removal of the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were raised up with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having cancelled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. When he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So it was verse 16 that really made me think about the Sabbath day. And initially I thought, well, this means that at least it's not bad that we do the Sabbath, because it says in verse 16 that let no one judge you for doing the Sabbath. The reason that I read so many verses in order to explain this is that it gives us context. And the context that is here, we can see that the people that Paul is writing to are not Jews. Verse 13 says, when you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh. Meaning that the people that he's talking to have not been circumcised, meaning they're not Jews, they're actually Gentiles. And he's telling the Gentiles, because they have been baptized, which is the circumcision of the heart, which we can see in verse 11, the circumcision that's made without hands, because they have been baptized, that gives them the right to do the Sabbath, the new moons, eat biblical food, and do the festivals. Essentially, that's what he's saying. Let no man judge you in a new moon or a Sabbath. It doesn't say, let no man judge you in not doing it. It says that these Gentiles should feel confident that nobody can judge them when they do the biblical commandments of following the Sabbath, following the new moon, etc. So the reason that I need to point that out is because this verse often gets twisted by people saying that it doesn't matter what day you do the Sabbath on. This passage doesn't say that at all. It says, let no one judge you in keeping a Sabbath. It's very straightforward. So I want to explain the term shadow of things to come as well, because I've seen people use that in a negative term, meaning that it's baseless and it means nothing. This is actually Paul saying that what you're doing is good because the substance is of Christ. It means that the Sabbath is of Christ. Now, when he uses the word shadow of things to come, he's referring to the kingdom of heaven. He's talking about what we are going to do when we enter into heaven. We will do Sabbaths when we get to heaven. We will do the new moon when we get to heaven. It's a shadow of the good things to come. That shadow isn't something that's negative. It's actually a hope of what we are going to do when we enter into the kingdom of heaven. The last passages that I want to read here are all verses that say the same thing. And this is where Jesus professes to be Lord of the Sabbath. We see this in Matthew 12:8. Jesus says, "For the Son of Man is the Lord even of the Sabbath." In Luke 6:5, he says, "And he said to them, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." Mark 2:27-28, he says, "And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." So Jesus refers to himself as Lord of the Sabbath. So I find it very unusual that Christians today would not follow the Sabbath as commanded by God, because, our name is Christians. We're supposed to follow Christ. We're supposed to do what he says and walk in his footsteps. So if Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, then doesn't that mean that we should keep the Sabbath day holy, that we should do the Sabbath correctly, so that we don't anger God, that we don't follow that same example of disobedience that the Israelites did? These are the verses that really, really convinced me in the end. Not just, any one of them, but as a group, these verses convinced me that as Christians, we should do the Sabbath. We should keep the Sabbath day holy according to how it's described in the Bible. Of course, these are not just the only verses about the Sabbath. There's more that we need to learn about the Sabbath in order to keep it holy, in order to do the Sabbath correctly, so that we do not offend God, that we're not disobedient to God. Okay, but the purpose of this show, the purpose of this video, is to just describe what verses made me think we need to keep the Sabbath. So I'm asking you today to think about these verses that I've shared with you, and to think about where you are spiritually and what God wants you to do and what you need to do to show your love for God. If you love God, you will keep his commandments. Remember, Jesus says the number one commandment, the greatest commandment of all, is to love God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. Jesus also said, if you love me, keep my commandments. The Sabbath is obviously one of their commandments. God sanctified the Sabbath day at the beginning of time, essentially. And then he asked us to keep that Sabbath day holy. We see in the history of the Bible that God is offended by people when they actually break his rules about the Sabbath. And it's written in the Old Testament and New Testament that we should be obedient, lest we follow that same example of disobedience. We don't want to follow that example of disobedience that the Israelites did when they were in the desert, and God ended up killing most of them before he allowed them to enter into the promised land. We need to believe in Jesus. We need to be obedient to Jesus. Part of believing in Jesus is believing what he says and doing what he says. So that means that we should do what he commands. So I'm asking you today to open up your heart and to accept Jesus. Accept God's will. It is God's will that the Sabbath be kept holy. It's God's will that we obey his commandments. Let's not forget the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Well, that's all for today, folks. My name is Kent. Farewell and God bless.